The gunshot echoed across the Wyoming plains like a death sentence, sending crows scattering from the twisted branches of the old oak tree. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the corner of the wooden crate that had served as her refuge during the endless train journey from Boston, her small hands trembling as she peered through the gaps in the barn wood. The man standing in the doorway held a smoking rifle, his weathered face stone-cold as he stared down at something in the dirt. Blood pooled in the dust beneath what remained of a rabid coyote, its foam-flecked muzzle still twisted in a snarl even in death. William Henderson lowered his rifle slowly, his gray eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting more trouble to emerge from the September heat waves that danced across his failing wheat fields. Sarah had arrived only an hour earlier, delivered like a package by the stern-faced railroad conductor who'd barely waited for Bill's reluctant nod before departing on the afternoon train back east. She was nothing like what he'd expected when the Boston Children's Aid Society had written about sending him help with his farm work. The letter had been brief and businesslike, mentioning only that a child was available for placement with a respectable farming family, someone who could assist with daily chores in exchange for room, board, and basic education. What stepped off that train was not the sturdy farm boy he'd envisioned, but a pale, round-faced girl with dark circles under her eyes and clothes that hung on her small frame like empty grain sacks. Her brown hair was cropped short and uneven, clearly cut by someone with little skill or care, and her shoes were so worn that pieces of cardboard peeked through the holes in the soles. Now, as Bill turned back toward the barn, he found those same dark eyes watching him with a mixture of terror and fascination. The girl hadn't moved from her hiding spot since arriving, hadn't spoken a single word when he'd showed her where she'd be sleeping, in the small room off the kitchen that had once been a pantry. "You can come out now," Bill said, his voice rougher than he'd intended after years of speaking mainly to livestock and the occasional traveling merchant. "Danger's past." Sarah remained frozen, her small body wedged between the crate and the barn wall. She'd learned not to trust adults who claimed danger had passed. In her 8 years, danger had a way of wearing different faces and arriving from unexpected directions. Bill approached slowly, the way he might approach a spooked horse. Up close, he could see that what he'd initially mistaken for defiance in her posture was actually fear so deep it had become a permanent part of her stance. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, and there were old bruises on her wrists that spoke of restraints and rough handling. "What's your name, child?" he asked, crouching down so he wouldn't tower over her small frame. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind rustling through the barn's loose boards. "Sarah Whitmore." "Well, Sarah Whitmore, I'm Bill Henderson. This is my farm, and I reckon it's yours now too, for as long as you're minded to stay." She looked up at him then, really looked, taking in his graying beard and the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too many seasons squinting into harsh sun and bitter wind. His clothes were clean but patched, his hands scarred from years of hard work, and something in his expression reminded her of the old barn cat at the orphanage, the one that had learned to keep its distance but never quite forgotten how to hope for kindness. "Am I supposed to work?" she asked, the words coming out in a rush as if she'd been holding them back. "Mrs. Hutchins at the home said I was too fat and lazy for decent folks to want, but that farmers might take anyone who could carry slop buckets and collect eggs." Bill felt something twist in his chest at her matter-of-fact recitation of cruelty. Sarah wasn't fat by any reasonable measure, just soft in the way children should be, with round cheeks that suggested she was finally getting enough to eat after who knew how long without adequate meals. "Mrs. Hutchins sounds like a woman with more opinions than sense," he said quietly. "You look just fine to me. And yes, there's work to be done, but nothing you can't learn and nothing that can't wait until you've settled in proper." The late afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the barn's western windows, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Sarah studied those shadows as if they might reveal something important about her future, some clue about whether this weathered man with the gentle voice might be different from all the others who'd promised safety only to deliver disappointment. "Are you going to send me back?" she asked suddenly, the question coming out sharp and desperate. "When you figure out I'm not what you wanted?" Bill was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. The truth was, he hadn't wanted anyone. The letter from Boston had arrived during a particularly difficult week when his arthritis was flaring and the harvest looked to be even worse than last year's disaster. He'd ridden back in a moment of weakness, thinking perhaps a strong boy might help him get through the winter preparations. Instead, he'd received this fragile little girl who looked like she'd been through more hardship than most grown men. Part of him wondered if there hadn't been some mistake, if Sarah was supposed to be delivered to some other family, one that actually wanted a child rather than just another set of hands to help with the endless work of keeping a failing farm afloat. But looking at her now, seeing the way she held herself ready to flee at the first sign of rejection, he found himself remembering another frightened creature he'd taken in years ago. A half-wild Mustang mare, beaten and starved by previous owners, who'd arrived at his farm more dead than alive. Everyone had told him to put the horse out of its misery, that some things were too broken to fix. That mare had lived another 15 years, eventually becoming the gentlest, most reliable horse he'd ever owned. She died the same winter as his wife, Mary, and sometimes Bill wondered if grief hadn't taken them both. "I don't make promises lightly, Sarah," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made her look up at him again. "But I'll make you one now. As long as you want to be here, you've got a place. No matter what anyone back in Boston might have told you about yourself, no matter what you think you can or can't do, you've got a home here if you want it." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the lies adults so often told children. What she saw instead was a loneliness that matched her own, emptiness in his eyes that spoke of losses too deep for words. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't even know me." Bill stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and extended his hand toward her. "Sometimes knowing comes after, not before. Sometimes you just have to trust that things work out the way they're supposed to." Sarah looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before slowly unfolding herself from her hiding spot. Her small fingers felt like ice when they touched his palm, and he was struck by how fragile she seemed, how easily she could be damaged by careless words or rough treatment. As they walked toward the farmhouse together, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, neither of them could have imagined how this moment would be remembered years later. Sarah couldn't know that she was taking the first steps toward the only real home she'd ever have, and Bill couldn't see that he was about to discover that saving someone else might just be the key to saving himself. The farmhouse itself was modest, built from local timber and stone, with a wide front porch that had once been Mary's pride and joy. Now the porch swing hung motionless, its paint peeling and one of the chains beginning to rust. The flower boxes that had once overflowed with Mary's prized roses and sunflowers now held only dried stems and memories. Inside, the house felt hollow, as if all the warmth had been drained from it and never replaced. The furniture was still there, the kitchen still functional, but everything had the dusty, unused quality of a place where someone was merely existing rather than truly living. "You'll sleep in here," Bill said, opening the door to the small room off the kitchen. He'd hastily cleaned it out that morning, moving boxes of Mary's preserved goods to the cellar and sweeping away the dust and cobwebs. A narrow bed with a corn husk mattress sat against one wall, covered with quilts that smelled faintly of lavender and neglect. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." Sarah stepped into the room slowly, as if entering sacred ground. She'd never had a room of her own before. At the orphanage, she'd slept in a dormitory with 15 other girls, their beds so close together that she could hear every whisper, every sob, every nightmare that echoed through the long hours before dawn. "It's beautiful," she said softly, running her fingers along the window sill where someone had carved the initials, M.H., with careful precision. "Mary's work," Bill said, noticing her discovery. "My wife. She used to sit by that window and watch for the mail carrier, especially when she was expecting letters from her sister back in Ohio." "What happened to her?" Sarah asked, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry. Mrs. Hutchins always said I asked too many questions." "Mrs. Hutchins was wrong about a lot of things, it seems," Bill replied. "Mary took sick 3 winters ago. Fever that wouldn't break. By the time I could get the doctor out here through the snow, it was too late." He didn't mention the baby, the son who'd never drawn breath, who'd been buried beside his mother in the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. Some griefs were too heavy to place on a child's shoulders, especially one who'd already carried more than her share. As darkness began to settle over the farm, Bill lit the oil lamps and set about preparing a simple supper of cornbread, beans, and salt pork. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her eyes following his every movement as if memorizing the rhythm of his routine. She'd learned to read adults by watching their hands, their posture, the set of their shoulders when they thought no one was looking. Bill's movements were economical but not harsh, careful but not hesitant. When he set a plate in front of her, the portion was generous without being overwhelming, and he waited until she'd taken her first bite before beginning to eat his own meal. "Tell me about Boston," he said quietly, cutting his cornbread into precise squares. "What was it like at the home?" Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and for a moment Bill thought she might retreat back into her earlier silence. Instead, she set down her fork and looked directly at him, as if making some kind of decision. "It was gray," she said simply. "Everything was gray, all the time. The walls, the floors, the uniforms they made us wear. Even the food seemed gray. And it was loud, always loud, with crying and shouting and bells ringing to tell us when to wake up and when to eat and when to pray." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "There were 63 children when I left, but the number changed sometimes. Kids would disappear in the night, sent away to families or work or—" She shrugged, unable or unwilling to finish that thought. "How long were you there?" Bill asked. "4 years. Since I was 4. My mama died of the consumption, and there wasn't anyone else to take me. At least, that's what they told me. Sometimes I wondered if there might have been someone, somewhere, but they never looked very hard." The simple acceptance in her voice broke something inside Bill's chest. He thought of his own childhood on a farm not unlike this one, surrounded by parents and siblings and aunts and uncles who'd argued and laughed and filled every corner of the house with noise and life. The idea of a 4-year-old child facing the world completely alone was almost more than he could bear. "Well," he said, clearing his throat roughly, "you're not alone anymore." After supper, they sat by the fire in the front room, Sarah curled in Mary's old rocking chair while Bill worked on mending a broken harness by lamplight. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with uncertainty and fear. "Mr. Henderson?" Sarah's voice was drowsy, the warmth of the fire and the first full meal she'd had in days making her eyelids heavy. "Just Bill," he said without looking up from his work. "Mr. Henderson makes me feel like my father, and he was considerably more respectable than I'll ever be." She giggled softly at that, the first genuinely happy sound she'd made since arriving. "Bill, then. Do you really mean what you said? About me staying?" He set down his tools and looked at her directly, this small girl who'd somehow found her way into his carefully ordered, solitary life. "Sarah, I've made a lot of mistakes in my 45 years, but I don't make promises I can't keep. You have my word." As Sarah drifted off to sleep in the rocking chair, her small face peaceful in the firelight, Bill found himself wondering what Mary would have thought of this unexpected addition to their home. She'd always wanted children, had grieved quietly each time hope turned to disappointment, had finally accepted that it wasn't meant to be only months before her death. Perhaps this was her doing somehow, her way of ensuring he didn't spend the rest of his life alone with his regrets and his failing crops and his slowly deteriorating farm. Perhaps some destinies were too important to be left to chance. Outside, the Wyoming wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds dancing across the moonlit yard. Winter would be coming soon, and with it the harsh test that separated those who belonged on the frontier from those who didn't. But for the first time in 3 years, Bill Henderson felt something stir in his chest that might have been hope. And in her sleep, Sarah Whitmore smiled, dreaming of a place where the walls weren't gray and no one rang bells to tell her when to be afraid. Neither of them knew that the real test was still to come, that the bond forming between them would be challenged in ways they couldn't imagine, and that before spring arrived, they would both have to choose between safety and love, between the familiar pain of loneliness and the terrifying possibility of family. The fire burned low as the night deepened, casting dancing shadows on the walls of a house that was slowly, carefully, beginning to remember what it felt like to be a home. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival, and the rhythm of farm life had begun to settle around them like dust after a windstorm. She had proven surprisingly capable despite her small size, collecting eggs with gentle efficiency and helping Bill tend to the vegetable garden that had been neglected since Mary's death. Her presence had awakened something in the house itself, as if the walls had been holding their breath and could finally exhale. But it was on a cold October morning, when frost painted the windows in delicate patterns, that everything changed. Sarah was in the barn feeding the chickens when she heard Bill's sharp intake of breath from the stall where their aging mare, Duchess, spent her nights. She peered around the corner to find him kneeling in the straw, his weathered hands trembling as he held what appeared to be a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate symbols that seemed to dance in the dim morning light. "Where did this come from?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. Sarah approached cautiously, her bare feet silent on the packed earth floor. The box was beautiful but strange, made from a dark wood she didn't recognize, with silver inlays that formed patterns like nothing she'd ever seen in the orphanage's simple chapel or in any of the few books she'd been allowed to read. "Duchess must have been hiding it," Bill said, his voice thick with emotion. "All this time, she's been protecting it." He opened the box with reverent fingers, revealing a collection of items that made no immediate sense. A lock of golden hair tied with blue ribbon. A small daguerreotype of a woman Sarah had never seen, though her eyes held the same warmth as Bill's. Several letters written in a delicate hand. And at the bottom, wrapped in silk, a tiny pair of baby shoes that had never been worn. "My son," Bill breathed, lifting the shoes with infinite care. "Mary hid these before she died. She must have asked Duchess to guard them, knowing I'd never think to look in her stall." Sarah watched as tears tracked down his cheeks, understanding without being told that she was witnessing something sacred, something that had been meant to remain hidden until the right moment arrived. But why now? Why had Duchess chosen this morning to reveal her secret? As if summoned by the question, the old mare nickered softly from behind them. Sarah turned and gasped. Duchess stood swaying on unsteady legs, her breathing labored and her eyes clouded with the unmistakable approach of death. The horse had been failing for weeks, but this morning brought the final goodbye she'd been postponing. "She was waiting," Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her like sunlight. "She was waiting until you weren't alone anymore." Bill looked up at her then, this strange, resilient child who'd arrived like an answer to prayers he hadn't known he was saying, and saw something that took his breath away. In Sarah's dark eyes, he glimpsed the same fierce protectiveness that had kept Duchess guarding her secret through 3 long years of grief, the same quiet strength that had carried his wife through months of knowing she would never see their child grow up. Duchess took her last breath as the sun crested the horizon, her duty finally complete. And in the golden light of that autumn morning, Bill Henderson finally understood why Sarah Whitmore had been sent to him, not as the help he'd thought he needed, but as the family he'd never known he was still hoping for. The wooden box sat between them like a bridge between past and future, its secrets finally shared, its burden of memory transformed into something that felt less like ending and more like beginning. Sarah reached out tentatively and touched Bill's weathered hand, her small fingers intertwining with his as they knelt together in the straw beside the mare who had kept faith even when faith seemed impossible. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the promise of winter and the whisper of stories yet to be told, of a love that had chosen them both when they needed it most, and of the mysterious ways that broken hearts sometimes heal each other without either person quite understanding how the magic works. The box would find its place on the mantelpiece, its treasures honored but no longer hidden. And someday, when Sarah was older, Bill would tell her the rest of the story about the woman in the photograph and the baby who had lived only in dreams, about the mare who had loved them both enough to wait 3 years to let them go. But for now, it was enough to sit together in the warming barn, 2 solitary souls who had found each other across the vast emptiness of loss, and to know that sometimes the most important journeys begin not with leaving, but with finally arriving home.